The silence in the hospital room, thick with the smell of stale antiseptic and quiet misery, was violently shattered by the sound of her vicious, mocking laughter. My daughter-in-law Clara stood over my narrow bed, her expensive perfume, a sharp, aggressive blend of citrus and jasmine, clashing horribly with the sterile environment, making her presence feel like an active contamination. She leaned over the guardrail with a practiced casualness, treating my frail body as nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle soon to be cleared from her path. She actually laughed, a truly horrifying sound that held no humor, asking if the nurses had checked my purse for the paltry coins of my inevitable inheritance, confirming my final plan must proceed. I kept my own eyes shut, forcing my breath to remain shallow and reedy, maintaining the perfect illusion of an old woman barely clinging to consciousness, allowing her to believe her cruelty was unseen and her victory assured. Her fingernails, long and painted a shocking crimson, tapped impatiently against the chrome rail, the rhythmic tink-tink-tink sounding like a clock counting down to my final humiliation. Her greedy demands for the house keys and my bank details were not subtle. She treated my modest estate, this worn, old house, the small pension, as her overdue property, completely ignoring the genuine discomfort and chronic dizziness that had landed me here. This brazen, public disrespect was the absolute fuel I needed to execute the quiet, devastating revenge I had been meticulously planning for the 5 years since Robert died. I remembered the very day the performance began, the moment the mask fell completely, barely 24 hours after Robert's heart had simply stopped beating in his easy chair. The living room was quiet, sacred, heavy with unshed tears, and then Clara's voice, sharp and high-pitched, sliced through the air, loudly arguing with my son Thomas about filing an immediate claim on my life insurance. I heard her dismiss Robert's 40 years of honest labor as nothing but sentimental nonsense, ranting about the paltry coins, and demanding Thomas gain legal control over my finances before any relatives could interfere. That raw, casual cruelty, directed at the memory of the kindest man I ever knew, was the definitive signal that my life would henceforth be defined by a necessary, profound deception. Robert, my late husband, had spent his life managing expectations, not just money. A simple baker by trade, he had channeled every spare cent into a complex, hidden real estate trust, ensuring our financial security remained entirely invisible to greedy eyes. His final note, slipped to me just before he died, had been clear: they only see what they expect to see, let them see nothing. The initial lie of my meager estate, intended as protection, quickly matured into the ultimate weapon against Clara's insatiable demands, transforming my fear into cold, focused strategy. I would sell the story of poverty until the moment the law made her pay for her greed. My performance became a full-time role that required agonizing, constant commitment. I wore Robert's patched sweaters, walked slowly with a feigned limp, and adopted a reedy, confused tone whenever Clara brought up money. My daily walks to the grocery store were choreographed, where I sighed audibly over the price of butter, ensuring the neighborhood gossip network, Clara's most effective surveillance tool, carried the message of my financial hardship. Clara took immense, visible satisfaction in broadcasting my supposed destitution, always emphasizing how she and Thomas were the only ones caring for their poor, unfortunate mother-in-law, completely unaware her vicious gossip was the very material reinforcing the impenetrable shield of my secret wealth. The threat escalated into a tangible danger when Clara and Thomas demanded I sign a power of attorney (POA) to safeguard me from my failing memory. That near miss, where I narrowly averted financial ruin by feigning a dizzy spell, cemented my need for immediate action. I knew they were plotting not just to inherit, but to actively seize control of the house and liquidate my pension while I was still alive, viewing me as nothing more than a legal formality. Their cold-blooded willingness to orchestrate my ruin was the final, unassailable justification for the public, total destruction that awaited them. I listened in the hospital bed, the sound of Clara pacing near the door, her expensive shoes clicking impatiently, driving home the immense reality of my absolute isolation and the danger I was in. I was alone, but I was not defenseless. The complex, absolute legal documentation prepared by Mr. Hayes, my discreet city lawyer, was my ironclad defense. I had spent years meticulously ensuring that every asset, every deed, and every dollar of Robert's fortune was irrevocably tied up in a trust that Clara couldn't touch, ready for its final, devastating disposal. The true emotional violence of their constant greed meant that the only language they understood was loss. I opened my eyes slightly, watching Clara's silhouette against the pale light, her impatience a palpable force in the quiet room. She finally stopped pacing, pulling out her phone, her lips moving silently as she undoubtedly consulted her own lawyer about the fastest way to conclude this inconvenient illness. I closed my eyes again, feeling the familiar weight of Robert's invisible legacy, the truth I carried alone, and knew the grand, final performance was now mere hours away. The immense satisfaction of seeing her arrogance shattered, her entire life of greed reduced to nothing, was the only peace I truly needed. The cold fury I felt while feigning unconsciousness in the hospital room quickly gave way to a deeper, more profound pain, the memory of how quickly the mask had dropped and the truth of my legacy was poisoned. I closed my eyes, letting the clinical quiet of the room fade, and flashed back to the origin of the secret wealth, a story rooted in the honest, unassuming life of my late husband, Robert. Robert, the humble baker who smelled perpetually of yeast and cinnamon, had secretly managed a highly successful real estate trust for decades, a financial empire entirely unknown to our greedy son or his malicious wife. Robert had been a quiet genius of finance, using every penny he saved from the golden loaf to buy small, undervalued properties and secure them under interlocking, anonymous trusts, ensuring our security remained invisible. He had often joked, his eyes twinkling, that the best way to keep a treasure safe was to make sure no one thought it existed, a principle that became the bedrock of his financial life. He handed me the final legal documents and access codes just 2 days before his heart attack, his last act a profound declaration of love and foresight, making me the sole, silent beneficiary and controller of the entire estate. This secret, protective act was the very foundation of my power. I recalled the immediate, shocking moment after his funeral, when Clara mocked his meager pension and critiqued the old house, sealing my absolute decision to maintain the facade of poverty as a strategic weapon. We had just returned from the cemetery, the scent of fresh earth and sorrow still clinging to my black dress, when Clara had stalked into the kitchen and savagely dismissed Robert's lifetime of toil. "Honestly, Eleanor, 40 years of baking bread and this is it," she'd sneered, her voice thick with contempt as she gestured around the modest room. "A crumbling old shack and a pension that won't cover her heating bills. What a joke." Her cruel, casual dismissal of Robert's honest labor, a man who had only ever shown her kindness, hit me with the force of physical violence, extinguishing the last flicker of my raw grief and replacing it with icy resolve. She mocked his financial decisions, completely oblivious to the fact that his paltry savings were actually the millions secured in the revocable trust that now sat, invisible, in a downtown bank vault. That single, shocking moment of pure, unadulterated contempt for the man who had built our world became the ultimate justification for her total ruin. The lie born of necessity became my strongest, sharpest weapon. This self-imposed penury became my most effective armor. I started wearing Robert's patched sweaters, adopted a shuffling, frail gait, and rehearsed the language of financial hardship until it felt natural on my tongue. The lie became my constant companion, a heavy, rough coat I wore in public to ensure Clara and Thomas remained utterly convinced of my worthlessness. Every time Clara called to complain about my thrift or demand I sell the old house before it collapses, she was, in fact, reinforcing the very invisibility that was keeping Robert's massive legacy safe. I remembered standing at the old kitchen window, watching Clara pull away in her expensive car after another routine mockery session, and felt a profound, terrible satisfaction. She lived her life based on what was visible, what was loud, and what was immediately consumable, while Robert's power was built on silence, foresight, and absolute legal invisibility. This lie became her protection because their greed was so blatant, so loud, that they were constitutionally incapable of looking past the surface to see the magnificent, multi-million-dollar truth hidden beneath the facade of my old house and my paltry coins. The initial betrayal, Clara's immediate, cold-blooded contempt for the man who had just died, was what initially sealed my decision to maintain the facade of poverty. The ongoing abuse, the constant demands, and the POA incident simply gave me the moral certainty that the final act had to be not just private justice, but a massive public reckoning. The lie was the price I paid for my own freedom, ensuring that their corrosive greed would ultimately be the very instrument of their spectacular public self-destruction. The cold resolve I felt while feigning unconsciousness in the hospital room quickly gave way to a profound, desperate clarity. The time for patient performance was over, replaced by the terrifying urgency of self-defense. The POA attempt had been their final, hostile gambit, and my successful evasion was the definitive signal that my performance needed to achieve its climax immediately. The sound of my forced, reedy cough still echoed faintly in my memory, a chilling reminder of how close I had come to signing away my freedom and Robert's legacy to Clara's insatiable greed. I lay in the hospital bed, the crisp, white sheet feeling like a straitjacket against my skin, my body thrumming with the residual fear of that near-miss confrontation. My thoughts raced back to the original plan, the staged fall, the urgency, and the absolute necessity of dictating the final will while my health, or lack thereof, was a public spectacle. The tension was immense. I had to move faster than Clara's lawyer, faster than her greedy ambition, ensuring the final codicil was executed before they could revive the catastrophic power of attorney POA attempt. Delay was no longer an option, it was a guaranteed surrender. My son Thomas had only strengthened my resolve by his pathetic complicity, his moral failure a necessary counterweight to my iron determination. He hadn't defended me, he had only feared the complexity of a legal mess, confirming his own self-interest outweighed my well-being. This complete lack of filial loyalty was the final emotional fuel I needed to ensure the revenge was absolute, striking at the very core of his comfort and his wife's entitlement. I realized the only honest exchange left between us would be the public, devastating delivery of the consequence he had earned. I immediately demanded the hospital contact my discreet counsel, Mr. Hayes, insisting he drive down from the city at once, citing an urgent legal emergency that required his immediate personal attention. When he arrived, his face a mask of professional concern, I cut through the pleasantries with surgical precision, handing him the POA documents Clara had tried to force on me. "They tried to seize control today, Mr. Hayes," I stated, my voice low and fierce. "The window is closing. We execute the final codicil now, under the urgency of this hospital admission." I dictated the final, simple terms of the will's core document, confirming the transfer of the modest house and the small pension fund to Elias, my deserving grandson, and the local women's charity. This transfer was deliberately modest, designed to deceive Clara's legal team, who would be monitoring my assets. "This is the decoy, Mr. Hayes," I explained, watching his eyes widen with a silent question. "The true transfer will be detailed in the sealed amendment you hold, the one concerning the revocable trust." The immense multi-million-dollar wealth of Robert's invisible trust, the property of Legacy Holding, was the final, devastating weapon of my defense. Mr. Hayes, his hand visibly trembling as he transcribed the final legal terms, understood the immense power of the secret he held. I ensured the language of the final codicil explicitly demanded an official will reading take place at his private office within 48 hours of the document's notarization, ensuring there would be no time for Clara's legal team to organize a defense or launch a countersuit. The codicil, simple in its language yet ironclad in its legal structure, was signed and notarized right there in the hospital room, witnessed by a completely unwitting hospital administrator. This final execution was not merely paperwork, it was the definitive act that transferred all legal control out of my direct hands and into the unassailable fortress of the trust, making it irreversible. I lay back against the pillows, the physical pain of my knee surgery momentarily forgotten, feeling the cold, terrible peace of a strategist who had successfully deployed her ultimate weapon. I had won the battle against the POA, and now, the war against Clara's greed would finally conclude in a spectacular public reckoning. The cold terror of the POA attempt was gone, replaced by the immediate surgical determination to execute the final codicil of my will, transferring all power before Clara could launch her next attack. I lay in the hospital bed, the signed, notarized codicil, the decoy document, feeling solid under the thin sheet, the proof of my final legal act. The time for patient performance was definitively over. The war against Clara's greed would now conclude in a spectacular, public legal reckoning. I immediately demanded that Mr. Hayes secure an immediate appointment for the official reading at his opulent downtown office, ensuring the formality of the location would amplify the eventual shock. "The urgency is absolute, Mr. Hayes," I insisted, my voice low and firm. "I want the reading scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. I need this done before Thomas and Clara can revive the POA or file any countersuit." I explained that my goal was not merely to transfer assets, but to deliver a public, crushing blow to their years of entitlement, stripping them of all claim and all dignity. Mr. Hayes, recognizing the iron will beneath my frail facade, began the necessary legal maneuverings, his voice filled with professional excitement as he prepared the grand performance. He informed Clara's attorney of the mandatory will reading, a deliberate legal step designed to draw them both into the trap, and ensured the final, crucial details of the Robert Thorne Revocable Trust were prepared for their devastating reveal. I informed him of the immense, undisclosed wealth now finalized in trusts for my deserving grandson, Elias, and the local women's charity, making this a monumental, irreversible transfer of power. I spent the rest of the day in a state of tense, agonizing preparation, rehearsing my entrance, my demeanor, and my final, quiet role as the silent witness to their financial destruction. The memory of Clara's cruel laughter and Thomas's moral cowardice served as my anchor, reinforcing the necessity of my action. I knew the core of the document. The transfer of the modest house and remaining cash was merely the decoy, the small bait designed to draw them into the reading with smug, predictable confidence. The true weight of the estate lay within the sealed amendment, the invisible, multi-million-dollar trust that would be revealed only after Clara's initial, predictable burst of mockery had reached its peak. Mr. Hayes confirmed the total, absolute value of the estate, making me realize the full scale of the quiet financial genius Robert had exhibited over 4 decades. I was not just transferring a house. I was transferring a massive, invisible empire built on integrity and foresight, securing a legacy far beyond their greedy comprehension. My thoughts turned constantly to Elias, the young man whose quiet dignity was about to be rewarded with unimaginable wealth, a future secured by his own merit, not entitlement. I made a final call to Mr. Hayes, ensuring the trust stipulations were ironclad, funds released only upon the completion of his education, with provisions for a modest, manageable home, protecting him from his own parents' potential financial interference. The money had to be a foundation for his growth, not an engine for his family's corruption. The day of the reading arrived, cold and clear, the perfect backdrop for the stark, brutal clarity of the truth. I dressed in Robert's worn, gray sweater, deliberately cultivating the appearance of the frail, impoverished widow they expected, carrying nothing but a small, worn handbag and the crushing weight of the truth. I was driven to Mr. Hayes's luxurious office, feeling the physical shift from the realm of the sick into the high-stakes world of legal warfare. I was ready to witness the culmination of 5 years of performance and the absolute, irreversible deployment of my final, devastating weapon. The day of the reading arrived, cold and clear, the perfect backdrop for the stark, brutal clarity of the truth. I stepped out of the hired car, feeling the crisp morning air bite at my cheeks, immediately shifting my gait to the frail, shuffling walk of the impoverished widow they expected. I was dressed in Robert's worn, gray sweater, the rough wool a comforting reminder of his integrity, carrying nothing but a small, worn handbag and the crushing weight of the truth. This performance, cultivated for 5 years, was the last thing they would ever see me wear. The entrance to Mr. Hayes's firm was designed to intimidate, gleaming marble floors, hushed receptionists, and a pervasive aroma of expensive leather and old money. I moved slowly, allowing myself to be guided into the executive conference room, feeling the physical shift from the realm of the sick into the high-stakes world of legal warfare. The room itself was opulent, dark mahogany, heavy velvet curtains, and a long, polished table that would serve as the altar for the financial sacrifice. I positioned myself deliberately at the end of the table, facing the door, ready to witness the culmination of 5 years of performance and the absolute, irreversible deployment of my final, devastating weapon. Thomas and Clara arrived precisely on time, their entrance a jarring contrast to the room's dignified silence. Clara was dressed aggressively, wearing a tailored suit in a sharp, unforgiving emerald green, her massive gold watch gleaming under the recessed lighting. She looked less like a grieving relative and more like a predator arriving for a scheduled feast. Thomas walked beside her, his face a nervous mask of practiced solemnity, his eyes darting immediately toward the table, scanning for the documents he believed held his guaranteed fortune. They were so consumed by their own greedy expectation that they barely offered me a curt nod, settling immediately across the table from me. The atmosphere was thick with contempt and greedy anticipation. Clara made no effort to hide her impatience, tapping her crimson-painted fingers against the mahogany, her eyes fixed on Mr. Hayes's briefcase. Mr. Hayes, his face an impressive mask of professional neutrality, finally cleared his throat, commanding the room's attention with a single, deliberate sound. He slid his spectacles down his nose and began the formal reading, starting with the decoy assets, the details of the small pension fund, the insurance policy, and the disposition of the old house. He read out the modest, predictable numbers, confirming that the house and the small sums were to be divided between the local women's charity and my grandson, Elias. The sound of the small, expected figures was the trigger for Clara's predictable reaction. She let out a loud, theatrical sigh of relief, leaning back in her chair with a visible shrug that declared the matter settled, the meager inheritance confirmed. She looked directly at me, my worn sweater and frail appearance confirming her bias, and actually erupted in a smug, mocking laugh about the small, final value of my life. "Well, thank God that's over," Clara drawled, her voice thick with condescension, completely unaware that she was speaking her final, unguarded words before the complete destruction of her world. "Looks like Thomas and I will have to chip in for the funeral, darling. We can't have Mother embarrassing us with a pauper's burial." She leaned into Thomas and whispered loudly, "Only enough for a small plot, Thomas, nothing excessive." Her laughter, sharp and brittle, was the definitive, cruel punctuation mark on 5 years of my endured scorn. Then Mr. Hayes's voice, cold and utterly composed, sliced through her smug merriment, introducing the unexpected. "That concludes the reading of the visible assets," he stated, his face unchanging. He lifted a thick, pristine white envelope, secured with a heavy gold seal, and placed it sharply on the table. "However, there is a sealed amendment detailing the transfer of the primary assets held within the Robert Thorne Revocable Trust." Clara's laughter died instantly, choked off by the chilling sight of the document. Her eyes, which moments ago had been glittering with small contempt, grew wide and fixed on the immense thickness of the new document, a sudden, terrifying realization dawning that she had miscalculated everything. She reached out, her fingers trembling, grabbing Thomas's wrist with a frantic, painful grip, her composure utterly shattered by the mere visual proof of the secret wealth. The weight of the deception, the full, crushing force of the invisible millions Robert had saved, was finally revealed. She looked at me, the silent woman in the gray sweater, with dawning terror, realizing her mocking laughter had been the precise trigger for her catastrophic, inevitable ruin. Clara's laughter died instantly, choked off by the chilling sight of the gold-sealed document, transforming her face into a mask of pure, absolute devastation. The silence that followed Mr. Hayes's introduction of the sealed amendment detailing the multi-million-dollar trust was heavy, suffocating, and absolute, broken only by the sound of Thomas's ragged, disbelieving gasp. Mr. Hayes, his face remaining a perfect mask of professional neutrality, reached out and delicately broke the heavy wax seal, the small, quiet sound of cracking paper feeling deafeningly loud in the opulent room. He paused, looking directly at the stunned, paralyzed faces of my son and daughter-in-law before beginning the ultimate, devastating recitation of the truth. "This sealed document confirms the transfer of the primary assets held within the Robert Thorne Revocable Trust," Mr. Hayes announced, his voice gaining a resonant, authoritative clarity that spoke of massive numbers and significant legal consequence. He bypassed the small house and the pension entirely, plunging directly into the deep, invisible heart of the family's secret wealth. He read out the immense, stunning figures, detailing the portfolio of commercial real estate holdings, the municipal bonds, and the equity investments, all held under complex shell corporations that Thomas and Clara had never even known existed. The numbers soared past 6 figures, into 7, and then into 8-figure totals, painting a picture of wealth that instantly shattered their world and dwarfed their own petty, greedy ambitions. I watched Clara's face during this relentless delivery, observing the slow, agonizing realization of the catastrophic scale of her mistake, a sight more satisfying than any financial recovery. Her eyes, wide and manic, were fixed solely on the figures Mr. Hayes was listing, her perfectly applied makeup unable to mask the sudden, terrifying shift from smug contempt to paralyzing horror. She reached out, her hand twitching, grabbing Thomas's wrist with a frantic, painful grip, her composure utterly annihilated by the irrefutable, objective proof that she had spent 5 years mocking a millionaire. The heavy silence of the room was consumed by the sound of Mr. Hayes's voice detailing the final, invisible fortune, the undisclosed, multi-million-dollar trust. Mr. Hayes then systematically revealed the source of the immense, hidden fortune and the years of deception, using the narrative of the truth as a cold, powerful weapon. He calmly presented the notarized financial reviews and psychiatric evaluations, legally verifying that I was in complete control of my faculties during the execution of all trust transfers, including the final codicil. Mrs. Thorne's capacity was independently verified annually, he stated, tapping the file with unwavering authority, confirming that her decision to maintain a modest lifestyle was purely discretionary and in no way compromised her legal ability to manage this estate. This meticulous legal detail destroyed any chance for their desperate claim of fraud or my supposed mental incompetence. The revelation of the lie's genesis, the subtle, brilliant financial structures Robert had established, hit them with the full, crushing weight of their own moral failure. They had mocked the honest baker and abused the frail widow, entirely blind to the fact that they were mocking the architect of a fortune and abusing the executor of their fate. Clara finally found her voice, a strained, desperate squeak instantly choked by the immense shame. "It's a lie, she's lying, she wore those terrible clothes," she cried, her voice cracking as she desperately grasped for any thread of her comfortable, ruined reality. Mr. Hayes ignored her hysterical denial, his professionalism absolute as he moved to the final, necessary theatrical flourish, the absolute end of her entitlement. He reached into his inner breast pocket and retrieved a small, velvet-lined box, the dark material lending the tiny container a terrible, profound significance. He looked directly at Clara, whose eyes were fixed manically on the box, desperately searching for some hidden, valuable trinket, and delivered the ultimate, single, brutal line of the codicil. "And finally, Mrs. Thorne's final bequest to her daughter-in-law, Clara," Mr. Hayes announced, his voice slowing, delivering the words with the cold, surgical timing of a master executioner. He placed the small box directly in front of her, sliding it across the polished mahogany table with a slow, deliberate movement that allowed the emotional gravity of the moment to fully settle. Then, with devastating patience, he reached out and flipped the lid open with a crisp click, revealing the single, glittering object nestled inside the dark velvet lining, a perfectly new, shining copper coin, a single, newly minted penny. Clara's face instantly dissolved, her features liquefying into a grotesque mask of rage and utter, absolute disbelief, her dignity shattering in 1,000 painful, audible pieces. "A penny," she shrieked, the sound high-pitched and animalistic, slamming her hand down on the table and knocking over a water glass, the sound of splintering crystal unable to drown out her horror. Mr. Hayes delivered the final, crushing blow with an icy, unforgiving formality. "Mrs. Thorne leaves this coin to you, Clara, as your full and final inheritance from the Robert Thorne estate, a gift acknowledging the precise monetary value she places upon your relationship." Clara's face, a mask of sheer, shattered devastation, immediately contorted into a furious, panicked scramble to salvage her ruin, transforming the legal room into a scene of raw chaos. "A penny," she shrieked, the sound high-pitched and animalistic, slamming her hand down on the mahogany table with a force that sent the velvet-lined box spinning. "You deceitful, disgusting old woman, this is fraud, you can't do this." Her voice cracked with the absolute desperation of a woman who had just seen 5 years of calculated effort annihilated by a single coin. She was not just angry, she was consumed by a blinding, feral rage aimed solely at destroying the source of her humiliation. The immense, chaotic outburst instantly pulled my son, Thomas, out of his terrified paralysis, but not to defend me, to attack the truth. He lurched across the table, his face a terrifying blend of accusation and panic, yelling directly at Mr. Hayes, the lawyer who held the proof of his absolute ruin. "You're part of this. This is a conspiracy. My mother is senile, she's incompetent. You forged this whole trust." Thomas screamed, grabbing a stack of documents and hurling them toward the large, ornate windows, desperate to physically destroy the evidence that had just destroyed his future. He chose to attack the rule of law rather than accept the consequence of his moral failure. I stood firm, the silent center of the emotional storm, allowing my cold, righteous fury to override the painful ache of motherly instinct. I looked directly at my son, whose veins were bulging with irrational rage, and let him see the unwavering, unforgiving judgment in my eyes. "The documents were notarized and confirmed by independent physicians, Thomas," I stated, my voice low, clear, and steady, cutting through his hysteria with the sharp, cold edge of objective fact. "Your lawyer knows the truth. The only conspiracy here was the one you and Clara built on greed and lies." Mr. Hayes, whose professionalism was an astonishing anchor in the swirling chaos, immediately took command, his voice gaining a resolute power that demanded obedience. He stepped forward, putting his body between me and my attacking son, and calmly detailed the documented years of their financial exploitation, stripping away every layer of their desperate denial. He cited specific dates of the POA demands, the quiet threats, and the financial pressures, confirming that their actions were not acts of care but systematic, criminal elder financial abuse. The devastating legal specificity of the evidence was designed not just to refute their claims, but to force them into absolute, irreparable legal ruin. I addressed my son one last time, allowing the truth to settle between us like a final, uncrossable chasm. "You chose her corrosive greed, Thomas, over the foundational stability and love of your mother. You valued the lie of immediate luxury over integrity and loyalty." I confirmed that the years of neglect, the constant demands, and the celebration of my supposed death had led to this final, absolute separation. He had chosen his path, and now the consequence was due. His moral failure had been rewarded with a single, shining penny and the loss of everything he had ignorantly coveted. The sheer volume of evidence presented, the psychiatric evaluations, the notarized trust documents, the detailed ledger of their debt, was utterly irrefutable, leaving Clara and Thomas with nowhere to hide. Mr. Hayes delivered the final, chilling legal sentence. They faced not only absolute disinheritance and the loss of the modest house, but a looming, devastating civil lawsuit for the years of documented financial exploitation. This legal ruin, stemming from the very assets they sought to steal, ensured their public disgrace would be absolute and enduring. I watched as the weight of the complete truth finally broke Thomas. His furious energy collapsed into a pathetic, shuddering defeat. He stopped shouting, sank to the floor next to the shattered glass, and buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with the profound, raw sobs of total, devastating loss. He realized in that agonizing moment that the price of his moral cowardice was not just the inheritance, but the complete, absolute destruction of his relationship with his mother and his own future. This separation was the final, tragic cost of their greed. The final confrontation had ended, leaving behind the stark, brutal reality of total separation, and I was left to face the terrible, profound emptiness of my final victory. I watched the police, called discreetly by Mr. Hayes, finally escort Thomas and Clara from the building, their heads bowed low in utter shame, their path leading to immediate legal consequences and social disgrace. The image of my son, broken and sobbing over the loss of a fortune he never earned, was a terrible burden I knew would weigh on my conscience, but I recognized the necessary cruelty of my actions. I sat down, pulling myself onto the velvet sofa, feeling the cold, immense pressure of the past 5 years finally dissipate, replaced by the heavy, complex clarity of my new freedom. The initial, immediate satisfaction of victory was long gone, replaced by the profound, difficult work of reflection on the painful but necessary separation. I contrasted the false, quiet peace of my elaborate poverty facade, the constant fear of discovery, the years of suppressed rage, with the raw, authentic happiness I felt now, purchased at the devastating cost of severing the final tie to my only child. My thoughts turned immediately to Elias, my grandson, the single source of genuine light and integrity in my ruined family. I called him instantly, my voice trembling not with frailty, but with the raw emotion of the day, telling him to meet me immediately at Mr. Hayes's office. I needed him to understand that the immense wealth he was about to inherit was not a spontaneous gift, but a trust built entirely on the strength of his own character, secured by his moral code, not his bloodline. His deep, honest gratitude, I knew, would be the only true salve for the deep wound of the day. When Elias arrived, his face etched with confusion and concern, I explained the entire agonizing truth: Robert's genius, Clara's greed, and the 5 years I spent performing poverty to defend his future. He listened silently, absorbing the reality of my multi-million-dollar secret and the stunning cruelty of his parents' betrayal. "Grandma," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't care about the money. Why did you have to pretend for so long? Why did you endure that pain?" His question was my final, necessary penance, forcing me to articulate the core moral of the entire brutal scheme. "I had to protect the legacy, Elias," I explained, pulling him into a tight, fierce embrace. "But more importantly, I had to expose their true nature so you would never, ever confuse their greed with love. I ensured that the trust money became a force for good, not corruption, funding his education and securing a foundation built on integrity, free from any hint of Thomas or Clara's toxic influence. The first act of his inheritance was to secure a generous donation to the local women's charity, ensuring the money immediately served a purpose greater than personal luxury. The final lesson was brutal but absolute. I had won my life back, but only by recognizing that their greed was a disease, and the only cure was total, clean excision. I accepted the complete, final loss of Thomas, recognizing that the man he had become was a stranger I no longer needed. The enduring reflection was clear. The value of the penny was not a monetary insult, but a priceless lesson in dignity and the true cost of greed. I had left Clara with precisely the value she assigned to me, stripping her of everything else. I stood in the opulent office, watching Elias speak with Mr. Hayes, his face alight with a responsible, grateful clarity, and felt a profound, final sense of purpose. My old life, defined by fear and performance, was definitively over. My new life, built on honesty, independence, and the fierce protection of the innocent, was just beginning. I had chosen the necessary pain of justice over the continued misery of compromise.